The dirt was still fresh. Hester Dawson stood at the edge of the grave with her hands folded so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had gone white as bleached bone. The late October wind swept down from the Colorado mountains and cut straight through the black wool of her mourning dress, but she did not shiver. She had used up every last tremor her body owned in the hours before dawn, kneeling on the cold kitchen floor with her face pressed into her apron, crying in a silence so deep and controlled it was worse than any scream. Now there was nothing left in her but a terrible stillness, like the surface of a frozen creek that looks solid right up until the moment you step on it and it shatters beneath you. The grave marker was a simple wooden cross her neighbor Delphine had hammered together before sunrise. Hester had not asked for it. She had not asked for any of the people now gathered in a half-ring behind her either, but there they were, hats in hand, boots muddy, faces arranged into the particular expression people wear when they are genuinely sorry but have absolutely no idea what to say. Reverend Aldrich had already spoken his piece. The wind had stolen half his words before they reached her ears, which was probably a mercy. She had buried her husband Malcolm 9 months ago. Now she had buried her son. Thomas had been 4 years old. He had been sick since August, the kind of sick that the doctor in Millhaven could not name and could not fix, and Hester had watched it take him the way a river takes a sandbank, slow and certain and completely indifferent to her desperation. She had written to a physician in Denver. She had tried every remedy the almanac suggested. She had sat up beside his little bed for 47 nights in a row, and she had prayed until prayer felt like talking into an empty room. And still, she heard footsteps approach through the dry grass behind her, and she braced herself for another hand on her shoulder, another murmured condolence she would have to receive gracefully. Instead, a man came and stood directly beside her at the grave. Not behind her, beside her, like someone who intended to stay. She did not look at him immediately. She was looking at the small mound of earth and the wooden cross and the little tin horse she had placed against the base of it, because Thomas had loved horses above everything. Then the man spoke. "You do not have to carry all of this by yourself." His voice was low and unhurried. It carried no performance of sympathy, no careful distance. It was simply the most direct thing anyone had said to her in months, and it landed somewhere beneath her ribs like a coal dropped into dry timber, and she felt the warmth of it begin to spread before she had even decided how she felt about it. She turned her head and looked at him for the first time. Cyrus Winslow was 34 years old, built lean and broad-shouldered the way men get who spend their lives working land rather than fighting it. He had dark hair gone slightly silver at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from sandstone, and eyes the color of sage after rain, a particular gray-green that was neither one thing nor the other. He was holding his hat against his chest with both hands. There was fresh mud on his boots from a long ride, which meant he had come a distance to be here. Hester did not know him well. She knew he ran cattle on the Winslow spread 15 miles northeast of her property, that he had been the one to send his 2 ranch hands over to help with her harvest after Malcolm died, that he had a reputation in Millhaven for being the kind of man who paid his debts and kept his word, and never raised his voice in argument. She knew these things the way you know things about a neighbor in a country where neighbors are 15 miles apart from other people's mouths, from glimpses across a fence line, from a single brief exchange at the general store back in March. She had not expected him here. She had not expected that 6 words from a man she barely knew would be the ones to finally crack her open. "Mr. Winslow," she said, and was horrified to hear that her voice was not steady. "Cyrus," he said quietly, "please." She turned back to the grave because she needed somewhere to look that was not his face. "I do not know how to let anyone help," she said. It came out like a confession. It was a confession. "That is all right," he said. "I am not going anywhere." She did not respond. The wind moved through the grass. Behind them, the small gathering of neighbors began to disperse in ones and twos, boots scuffing away through the dry autumn ground, voices dropping to murmurs that faded with the distance. Hester and Cyrus Winslow stood at the grave of her son until everyone else was gone, and even then, for several long minutes afterward, neither of them moved. It was the first time in 9 months that Hester Dawson did not feel entirely alone. She would not understand until much later how much that single moment would change everything. 9 months before Thomas died, Hester had been a different kind of tired. She and Malcolm Dawson had come out to Colorado Territory from Ohio in 1874, which was what people did in 1874 if they had ambition and not much else. Malcolm had a homestead claim on 160 acres east of the Millhaven Valley, flat grazing land with a creek running through the lower quarter, and a view of the mountains that on clear mornings made you believe completely in the goodness of creation. They had built a sod house first, then replaced it with a proper timber frame structure in 1876 when the first cattle profits came in. By 1877 they had a small herd, a kitchen garden that produced abundantly, a barn with 4 stalls, and Thomas, who arrived squalling and enormous in February of that year, and immediately became the organizing principle of both their lives. It was a good life. Hester had never pretended otherwise. It was hard and it was isolated, and there were days in January when the snow came horizontal off the mountains, and she could not see the barn from the kitchen window, and she felt the smallness of the human enterprise so acutely it made her throat tight. But it was good. Malcolm was steady and decent, and he made her laugh, and that counts for a great deal when you are building something from the ground up on the edge of the known world. Then Malcolm got his leg caught in the fence mechanism he was repairing in January of 1878, and the bone snapped clean, and the infection that followed moved faster than anyone expected, and he was gone inside of 2 weeks. Just like that. The whole architecture of her life, rearranged in a fortnight. Hester was 28 years old. She had a 4-year-old child, 160 acres of cattle land, a small herd of 32 head, no family within 1,000 miles, and a debt to the bank in Millhaven for the lumber that had built the good house. She had also, and this was the part she would never speak aloud to anyone, a hidden terror so deep and constant it lived in her chest like a second heartbeat, the terror of making a mistake that would cost Thomas everything. Because Thomas was all she had left and she was all Thomas had, and that arithmetic was both the simplest and the most crushing thing in her world. She hired a boy from town, Ezra Potts, 16 and willing, to help with the cattle through the spring. She paid him in eggs and a small wage she could barely afford. She ran the place with the rigid efficiency of someone who cannot allow themselves to stop moving, because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean feeling, and feeling was a luxury she had suspended indefinitely. The neighbors helped when they could. Delphine and her husband Rolf Hosser brought food through the worst of February. The Aldrich family sent their older sons over to help with calving in April. And Cyrus Winslow, who she knew only by reputation and a handful of exchanges at the Millhaven General Store, sent 2 of his men over in May with no explanation other than a note that read, "Your spring work looks heavy. These men are yours until the end of the week. No obligation attached." She had accepted the help because she had needed it desperately, and because pride, when your child needs to eat, is a very easy thing to set aside. She had written him a short, formal letter of thanks. He had replied with an equally short note wishing her well and offering that if she needed anything further, she had only to send word. She had not sent word. She had taken care of things herself, which was what she did, which was what she knew how to do. Then Thomas got sick. It started as a summer cold and did not stop there. By September it had moved into his chest and settled in his breathing, and by October it had taken on a quality of permanence that the doctor in Millhaven, a young man named Farrow who was well-meaning but limited, described with clinical helplessness as a weakness of the lungs with no established treatment beyond rest and warmth and prayer. Hester tried everything. She sent letters. She stayed up nights. She did the praying. And in the second week of October, 1878, on a Tuesday morning that was clear and cold and entirely ordinary in every external respect, Thomas Dawson stopped breathing in his sleep, and Hester found him when she went to wake him for breakfast, and the world ended in the most ordinary possible way. She had neighbors there within hours. She did not know afterward who had ridden to tell them. The next 2 days were a blur of hands and voices and tasks that got done around her. The grave dug, the reverend summoned, the food brought. She moved through all of it with the same frozen efficiency she had brought to the months since Malcolm's death. Only now the efficiency had cracked somewhere underneath, and she was holding its shape together by main force of will. And then Cyrus Winslow came and stood beside her at the grave and said what he said, and she felt the crack spread all the way to the surface. He rode back to his ranch that evening. She watched him go from the porch, his dark figure diminishing against the copper and gold of the Colorado sunset, and she held onto the porch railing and breathed carefully until the threat of tears passed. She told herself it meant nothing, a neighbor being kind. The West was full of that, people looking out for one another because the land demanded it, because you could not survive out here alone and everybody knew it. But she went to bed that night with his voice still in her ears. You do not have to carry all of this by yourself. And for the first time since February, she slept without dreaming of disasters. He came back 4 days later. She saw him riding up the creek road from the kitchen window, and she had a very peculiar reaction to it, something that was partly alarm and partly relief, and partly something she refused to name, all arriving at the same moment in her chest like 3 people trying to walk through a doorway at once. She went to the door and opened it before he reached the porch steps. "Mr. Winslow," she said. "Cyrus," he said again. He was carrying something, a cloth-wrapped bundle in one hand and his hat in the other. "I hope I am not intruding. My housekeeper, Mrs. Alderson, she sent food. She said you would not be cooking properly, and she was probably right." Hester looked at the bundle and felt something complicated move through her. "That is very kind of her." "She also wanted to come herself, but her rheumatism is acting up," Cyrus said. "So I volunteered." There was a slight pause in which Hester recognized that he was being tactful, offering her the narrative that he was simply running an errand, giving her an easy way to receive the visit without having to confront whatever it actually was. She appreciated that more than she knew how to say. "Please come in," she said. He sat at her kitchen table, and she made coffee, real coffee from the tin on the shelf that she had been rationing since the money got tight, and she unwrapped Mrs. Alderson's bundle and found a roast chicken and a loaf of bread and a jar of preserved peaches and a small apple cake, and she had to grip the edge of the table for a moment because the generosity of it came at her sideways and threatened to level her. "Are you all right?" Cyrus asked. "I keep being surprised by kindness," she said. "I do not know why. There is no reason to be surprised by it." "There is every reason," he said simply. "You have been carrying everything alone for a long time. It is natural to forget that people will help if you let them." She sat down across from him with her coffee cup and looked at him directly for perhaps the first time. He met her gaze steadily and without any of the slightly uncomfortable pity she had been receiving from everyone else. He just looked at her like she was a person, not a tragedy. "How is your ranch?" she asked, because she needed to talk about something ordinary. "Doing well," he said. "I have 60 head this year, up from 45, good grass season." "You manage that alone." "I have 2 permanent hands, Walt and Percy, good men, and I hire on for roundup." "Malcolm and I had 32 head, she said. "I am down to 28 now, lost 4 to the sickness this summer." He nodded. "Do you plan to keep running it?" It was a direct question. She appreciated that too. Everyone else had been dancing around the subject of what she would do next with the elaborate care people apply to things they think are too raw to touch directly. "I plan to," she said. "I have the land. I have no intention of losing it." "What do you need?" he asked. She looked at him. "I beg your pardon. What do you need to make it work right now this season going into winter? What is missing?" No one had asked her that. They had offered condolences and casseroles and prayers. No one had asked what she actually needed in practical terms, as if perhaps the asking would be indelicate, as if perhaps her grief disqualified her from having operational requirements. She set down her coffee cup. My fence on the south quarter needs repairing. One of my barn roof planks is loose and will not survive a heavy snow. I am short on firewood by at least 2 cords, and I need to decide whether to winter my cattle at a reduced cost by selling 8 or 10 head now, or hold them through and risk a hard season. She paused. And I need to stop waking up at 3 in the morning convinced I have forgotten something essential, but I suspect no one can fix that one. Cyrus was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those gray-green eyes. I can have Walt ride over tomorrow for the fence, he said. I will bring the wood myself. I have a surplus from the cutting I did in September. The roof plank I can look at today before I leave if you have a hammer and nails. And regarding the cattle, I think you hold them. Winter grass in this valley has been adequate the past 3 years, and the indicators suggest this year will be similar. You will come out ahead in spring. Hester stared at him. Why are you doing this? He was quiet for a moment. Because you are a good person in a hard situation, and helping costs me very little and matters a great deal. He picked up his coffee cup. And because I have been a rancher in this country long enough to know that the most wasteful thing a community can do is let good land and good people go under when a little assistance could prevent it. It was a practical answer. She told herself she was glad it was a practical answer. She showed him the barn roof, and he fixed the plank himself right there, climbing up with the easy economy of motion of a man who has been fixing things with his hands his whole life. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him and felt the peculiar sensation of being looked after, which she had not felt since before Malcolm died, and which was simultaneously wonderful and frightening. Walt came the next day and fixed the fence on the south quarter. Cyrus came with the firewood the day after that, driving a wagon loaded with split pine that he and Walt unloaded and stacked against the house wall with an efficiency that made Hester feel slightly useless, though she managed to contribute meaningfully by keeping them supplied with coffee and not standing around watching. He stayed for supper that second time. She cooked properly for the first time since Thomas died, a proper meal with the chicken broth she had stretched and dried beans from the garden and cornbread, and they sat at her kitchen table as the late October dark pressed against the windows and talked. Really talked. The way people talk when they stop performing grief and comfort at each other, and start simply being 2 human beings in a room. She learned that Cyrus had come out from Tennessee as a young man of 22 in 1866, directly after the war ended, with his father's friend who had started the Winslow ranch originally as a sheep operation before Cyrus had steered it toward cattle. He had bought out his father's friend in 1872 and had been running it alone since then. He had never married. She asked him why and then immediately felt she had overstepped, but he did not seem to mind the question. I was engaged once, he said. In 1870, she was a woman I had known in Tennessee. She came out to see the country and decided she could not live in it. He said this without bitterness, just as a fact. She was right that it was not the life for her. I do not hold that against her. You never tried again. The ranch demanded a great deal of attention in the years when a man usually figures out his domestic life, he said. I am not sure I gave it the thought it deserved. It is strange, Hester said. I never thought about what it would mean to be without Malcolm because I never expected to have to. And now I cannot imagine not being without him, which sounds wrong. But what I mean is, the state of being alone has become so ordinary that it is hard to remember it was ever different. Cyrus looked at her steadily. Do you want it to be different? The question was so direct that it stopped her breath for a moment. Then she said, I think what I want is to stop being afraid all the time. I think alone and afraid got tangled up together and I cannot separate them clearly. He nodded. That makes sense. He did not say anything else about it. He finished his supper and thanked her for it and said good night and rode home in the dark, and Hester cleared the table and washed the dishes and went to bed. She lay in the dark for a long time thinking about a man who asked direct questions and waited for honest answers and did not try to manage what she was feeling. He came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. It became, without any formal announcement, a pattern. He would come on Sunday afternoons, sometimes with a practical purpose, a tool she needed, information about cattle prices from his contact in Denver, advice on the winter feed situation, and sometimes with no particular purpose at all except company. He would sit at her kitchen table and they would talk, and gradually the conversations expanded outward from practical ranching matters into territory that was harder to map but far more interesting. She told him about Ohio, about her family's farm there, about her mother who had been a school teacher and had read to Hester every night until she was 12, and had given her a hunger for books that the frontier largely denied. He listened to all of this with complete attention, the kind of listening that made you feel that what you were saying was genuinely worth hearing. He told her about Tennessee, about growing up during the years leading to the war and the way the world had felt progressively more wrong to him even as a child, and about leaving and never going back, and about the strange freedom and terror of building a life in a place where nothing carried the weight of memory. "Does it ever feel like a loss?" she asked. "Not having that weight?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "There is something to be said for places that know you. Out here you start entirely from what you make of yourself. That can feel lonely." "It does," she said. "It feels very lonely." Their eyes met across the table, and something happened in that exchange that neither of them addressed directly, but which changed the temperature of the room in a way they both felt. November came and brought its iron cold down from the mountains. The cattle settled into their winter patterns. The creek froze at its edges, and the morning smelled of snow. Hester found a rhythm to the days that felt almost sustainable, if not yet comfortable. She tended the stock with Ezra's help 3 mornings a week, maintained the house, wrote in her journal in the evenings, and on Sunday afternoons she had conversation and coffee with Cyrus Winslow, and it was that last part that she found herself thinking about most during the rest of the week. She was not naive about what it meant. She was 28 years old and not particularly inclined toward self-deception. She was developing feelings for this man, specific and real feelings, and they were complicated by grief, and by the fact that she barely knew him, and by the question of what it meant to want something for yourself when you had spent so long existing entirely for someone else, first for Malcolm, then for Thomas. She talked to Delphine Hauser about it one afternoon in late November when Delphine came to return a borrowed pot. Delphine was a pragmatic German woman of 40 who had seen enough of life to be amused by it rather than frightened, and she listened to Hester's carefully constructed description of her situation with a small smile that got slightly larger as the description went on. "You are in love with him," Delphine said when Hester finished. "I have known him for 6 weeks," Hester said. "That is sometimes enough," said Delphine, "and sometimes 20 years is not enough. Time is not the measurement that matters. I barely know him." "You know him better than you are admitting," Delphine said. "I have seen you talk to that man at the store, Hester. You know each other quite well." Hester was quiet. "What are you afraid of?" Delphine asked. "That it is too soon. That I am confusing gratitude with something else. That I am simply reaching for comfort because I am not willing to keep being as sad as I am." She paused. "And that he does not feel the same way, and I will lose the only friendship I have built out here that actually feels real." Delphine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have watched Cyrus Winslow ride 15 miles on a Sunday for 6 weeks in a row to drink your coffee. I do not think you need to worry about the second concern." Hester looked at her hands. "The first concern," Delphine said more gently, "only you can answer. But I will tell you that the frontier does not give people the luxury of waiting until everything feels appropriate. And Thomas would not want you to be alone. Malcolm would not want that either." Hester felt the familiar grief move through her at their names, not the sharp, unbearable grief of the first weeks, but the duller, more permanent ache of loss that she understood she would carry forever, like a scar that no longer hurt but would always be there. "I know," she said. December arrived with a heavy snowfall on the 3rd that blanketed everything in a silence so thick it had texture. Hester woke to find 16 inches on the ground and spent the morning digging out the barn and making sure the cattle were secure with adequate feed. She worked until noon and then came inside and was standing at the kitchen stove, getting warmth back into her hands when she heard hooves on the road and went to the window and saw Cyrus coming through the snow on his big gray horse, both of them picking their way carefully through the drifts. She went to the door and opened it before he reached the porch. "You rode through that," she said. He dismounted and tied the horse and came up the steps, snow on his hat brim and his shoulders and his beard, which he had grown out in the cold weather and which made him look, she thought, remarkably solid and real. "I wanted to make sure you were managing." "It is Sunday," she said. "You came on Sunday anyway." As it happens, he looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and there was something different in them today, or perhaps she was finally letting herself see something that had been there for a while. "May I come in?" She stepped back and he came inside, and she took his coat and hung it by the stove to dry, and she made coffee, and they sat at the table, and for a while they talked about the snow and the cattle, and whether the storm would hold through the week. And then there was a silence that was different from the comfortable silences they had learned to share, a silence with something live and electric moving through it. Cyrus set down his coffee cup. "Hester," he said. She looked at him. "I need to say something directly," he said, "and I want to apologize in advance if the timing is wrong, because I am aware that you have been through losses that most people could not sustain, and I do not want to complicate your grief or presume on your circumstance." She held very still. "I have been coming here every Sunday for 6 weeks," he said. "And every day between Sundays I have been thinking about coming here, which is not a thing that happens to me without meaning." He held her gaze steadily. "I care about you, considerably. And I think I have been avoiding saying so directly because I was not sure of my reception, and I was not willing to risk losing what we have built, which I value enormously on its own terms." He paused, but it seemed dishonest not to say it. Hester was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then she said, "I have been thinking about you every day between Sundays as well." Something moved across his face that was quiet and real and not at all performative. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held onto his, and they sat like that in the snow-muffled quiet of her kitchen while the stove ticked and the horses outside stamped in the cold. "I do not want to rush anything," he said. "I understand that grief does not have a schedule, and I am not asking you to pretend it does." "You are very careful with me," she said. "You deserve to be treated carefully." She looked at their joined hands. "Malcolm was a good man," she said. "I want you to know that. I do not want to speak as if what I had with him was simply a past I am replacing. It was real, and I am still grieving it." "I know," he said. "I would not want it otherwise." "A woman who discarded her grief quickly would not be the woman you are, and the woman you are is exactly who I am talking about." She looked up at him. "You are quite good at this." The corner of his mouth lifted. "I have had a long time to think about what I would say if I ever got the courage to say it." She laughed. It was a small laugh, surprised out of her, and it felt strange in her throat because she had not laughed in so long, but it also felt clean and necessary, like the first breath of fresh air after a long time indoors. He stayed for supper again. And after supper, instead of sitting across from her at the table, he sat beside her on the settee near the stove, and they talked until the fire burned low and the night had gone fully dark and deep. And when he finally stood to leave, she walked him to the door, and he took her hand and held it for a moment and said, "I will see you next Sunday, or before, if you have need of anything." "I will probably have need of conversation," she said. "That is the easiest kind of need to meet," he said. He rode home through the snow, and she stood on the porch in her wool shawl and watched him until the dark swallowed him, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Something that was not quite happiness yet, because there was too much grief still mixed into everything for pure happiness, but was a direction, a pointing forward, a sense that the world contained something worth walking toward. The hard winter did what hard winters do to remote ranches. It demanded everything constantly and gave nothing back without a fight. In January, the temperature dropped to the kind of cold that turned breath to ice instantly, and made the simple act of hauling water from the creek to the barn a daily act of determination. 2 of Hester's remaining 28 cattle got into trouble in an ice patch, and she spent a full morning with Ezra working to free them. Coming inside that evening so cold and exhausted, she sat by the stove in her outdoor clothes for 20 minutes before she had the energy to take them off. Cyrus came twice that week, not just on Sunday. He came on Wednesday with Walt, and they repaired a section of fence that had gone down under the snow weight. And he came on Friday to help reinforce the barn doors against the wind that had been battering them. He worked alongside her and Ezra without condescension and without taking over the way some men did, but rather as someone who understood that it was her land and her operation, and he was there to help, not to manage. She noticed this. She noticed everything about him with a clarity that both pleased and slightly alarmed her. He had a habit of going very still when he was thinking, like an animal that conserves energy between efforts. He had excellent hands, the kind that could be rough with necessary work and gentle when gentleness was called for. He had a laugh that was infrequent, but when it came was completely genuine, not a social thing but the real article, and it changed his whole face when it happened. He was patient in a way that seemed native to him rather than adopted, a constitutional patience that came from somewhere deep in his character rather than from practice. She thought about the woman from Tennessee who had decided the country was not for her, and she thought, with a protectiveness she recognized was irrational given that Cyrus was a grown man of 34 who had managed perfectly well without her protection, that the woman had been a fool. In February, on a Sunday that arrived clear and viciously cold, Cyrus came and found her in the barn rather than the house, and she was sitting on a hay bale with her face in her hands, because it was the anniversary of Malcolm's death, and also the day Thomas would have turned 5 years old, and she had been holding it together all morning, and had finally come to the barn to fall apart where no one could see her. She heard his footstep and looked up, and he took in the situation in a single glance and sat down beside her on the bale and put his arm around her, and she turned her face into the solid warmth of his shoulder and let herself cry, properly cry, the way she had been preventing herself from doing for months. And she cried for Malcolm, and she cried for Thomas, and she cried for the life she had planned that had been rearranged without her permission. And Cyrus held her and did not say a word. Not one word. He did not tell her it was all right. He did not offer platitudes or encourage her to look at the bright side. He simply held her with a steadiness that suggested he could hold her as long as she needed and it would not put any particular strain on him. And when she finally stopped crying and sat up and pressed the back of her wrist against her eyes, he let her collect herself without comment. "I am sorry," she said. "Do not apologize for that," he said. "I feel like I should be further along than this," she said. "It has been a year." "Who decided there was a schedule?" he asked. "Who made that rule?" She laughed wetly. "Everyone, it seems." "Everyone is wrong," he said. "You grieve as long as you grieve. That is the only honest thing." She looked at him and felt the love she had been cautiously not naming since December arrive with complete clarity, like a landscape emerging from morning fog. It was not gratitude. It was not convenience or comfort-seeking or confusion. It was the real thing, specific to this particular man with his gray-green eyes and his constitutional patience and his habit of saying exactly what he meant without performance or apology. She said, "Cyrus." He looked at her. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was a small kiss, tentative, barely a thing. But his hand came up and cupped the side of her face, and he kissed her back. And it was one of those moments where time briefly reorganizes itself around the event, where everything before and after takes up positions relative to this single point. When she pulled back, he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something open and serious and entirely without its usual careful composure. "I have been wanting to do that for a while," she said. "I have been wanting you to do it for a while," he said. She laughed, and the laugh echoed in the cold barn, and the horses shifted in their stalls, and outside the February sky was the particular hard blue of winter at high altitude, and Hester Dawson realized she was going to be all right. Not immediately, not without further grief or difficulty or the long, slow work of rebuilding. But the direction was clear, and the direction was toward something good, and she had someone beside her for the walking. Spring came the way it always does in Colorado, arguing against winter for weeks before finally gaining the upper hand in mid-April when the temperatures climbed enough to keep, and the snowmelt ran the creek up to its banks, and the grass came back green and improbable out of the brown earth. Hester expanded her herd by 6 head with a purchase she had planned carefully over the winter. A calculated risk on a calf market she and Cyrus had analyzed together at her kitchen table one February evening with ledger books and pencils, working through the numbers with the particular focus of two people who understand that land and cattle are not romantic abstractions, but the literal substance of survival. He had asked her to marry him in March. He had done it at her kitchen table, which was where everything important between them had happened. And he had done it in exactly the way she would have expected from him, directly and without theater, asking if she would be willing to build something together with him, and making clear that he understood what she was bringing to that enterprise, not just her land and her practical capability, but her specific grief and her specific history and her specific self. And that he was asking for all of it because he wanted all of it. She said yes. She said it without hesitation, which surprised her a little, and then she thought about the months of Sunday conversations and the barn on February's anniversary day, and the way he had stood beside her at Thomas's grave, and said the 6 words that had cracked her open. And she thought, no, it does not surprise me at all. They were married in April, a small ceremony at the Millhaven church with the Hossers and the Aldriches and Mrs. Alderson and a handful of other neighbors in attendance, and then they moved her things to the Winslow ranch, which was larger and better equipped than her homestead and made practical sense as a base of operations, though they kept the Dawson land and folded its grazing into the expanded Winslow operation. The merged property was substantial, 240 acres in total, and Cyrus had ideas about expansion that Hester, who had spent the winter studying cattle markets and land prices, thought were well-founded. She brought Thomas's tin horse and set it on the windowsill of the main bedroom of the Winslow house, where it caught the morning light and reminded her every day of what she carried and what she had been given and what she owed it to both to make something of. The Winslow ranch house was larger than her timber frame had been, 4 rooms downstairs and 3 up, with a wide front porch that faced south toward the mountains and a kitchen that was twice the size of her old one. Mrs. Alderson came 3 days a week and was a person of such remarkable competence and such pointed opinions about the proper temperature at which biscuits should be baked that Hester, who had strong opinions of her own on the subject, enjoyed her enormously. That first spring on the combined ranch was one of the hardest working periods of Hester's life, which was saying something given the year that had preceded it. They were integrating 2 herds, rationalizing the grazing patterns across a larger land area, hiring an additional hand named George Tillman, who had been recommended by a rancher in Millhaven, and who turned out to be a careful and reliable worker. There were fences to reassess and water sources to evaluate, and a second barn on the Dawson property that needed structural work before winter. And through all of it, she and Cyrus worked together with a practicality and a mutual respect that she had not expected to find quite so effortlessly, though in retrospect she should have, because you do not build the kind of conversations they had over those winter months without also building the foundations of genuine partnership. They argued sometimes. She would be dishonest if she implied otherwise. They were both opinionated people with specific ideas about how things should be done. And there were moments in that first spring when the kitchen table became a site of vigorous disagreement about cattle management or land strategy, or the question of whether to take on a loan from the Denver bank to fund a summer purchase of additional breeding stock. The arguments were always about real things, never about power or territory or whose opinion mattered more, and they generally ended with one of them conceding that the other had the stronger case, or with a compromise that was better than either original position. She loved those arguments almost as much as she loved the Sunday afternoons, which had not stopped being Sunday afternoons simply because every day was now a day they were together. Sunday remained their day for conversation without agenda, sitting on the south porch in the spring warmth, talking about anything and everything, reconnecting in the specifically intentional way that Cyrus had established back when it was a 15-mile ride he was making once a week. "You taught me that," she told him one Sunday in May, both of them on the porch with coffee, the mountains bright with the last of the high snow above the tree line. "What did I teach you?" "That you have to be deliberate about the things that matter, that they do not maintain themselves." He looked at her. "Did you not know that before?" "I thought I did," she said, "but I think I let things be sustained by circumstance and proximity more than by intention, and then the circumstances changed." He was quiet for a moment. "I think the most important lessons are the ones that cost something." She thought about Thomas's tin horse on the windowsill and the grave with the wooden cross and all the things she had carried through that terrible year. "Yes," she said, "they are." He took her hand. She found out she was expecting a child in July. She sat with the knowledge for 2 days before she told Cyrus, because she needed to know how she felt about it herself before she could discuss it with anyone else. What she felt was enormous and complicated and layered, joy at the top of it, real and immediate joy, and beneath that a terror that was specific to what she knew now about how quickly and how completely the world could change, and beneath that a grief for Thomas that was not diminished by the joy but was rather sharpened by it, because he would never know this child and this child would never know him. She told Cyrus on the third morning, at breakfast, straightforwardly, because she had learned from him that directness was the only honest approach to important things. He put down his coffee cup very carefully. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was entirely unguarded. Then he stood up and came around the table and sat beside her and held her hands in both of his, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before, and he said, "Are you all right?" "I am very frightened," she said, "and very happy, both at the same time, which is an uncomfortable combination." "That seems right to me," he said. "Both things are true." "I keep thinking about Thomas," she said. "That is not a bad thing, it is just true." "Of course," he said. "That is right, that is how it should be." She looked at him. "You are not frightened." "I am extremely frightened," he said with a smile that was slightly unsteady at its edges. "I am 34 years old and I have never been a father and I have a great deal to learn in apparently 9 months." She laughed. "We will figure it out." "We will," he said. He put his arms around her and held her, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him, and felt the terror and the joy settle into a kind of acceptance that was not peace exactly, but was something adjacent to it, something she was learning to recognize as the feeling of living a real life rather than a managed one. The summer was full. The cattle did well on the summer grass, and the additional breeding stock Cyrus had purchased in May produced results that justified the investment. George Tillman proved himself 3 times over during the summer roundup, and Cyrus gave him a raise and offered him a permanent position, which George accepted with the restrained satisfaction of a man who has been looking for something to commit to. Hester, whose pregnancy announced itself to the rest of Millhaven by August in ways that could not be concealed by the cut of her dresses, received congratulations from the town with the same graceful directness with which she received everything, thanking people without performing either excessive happiness or becoming modesty. Delphine Hosser came in August and spent an afternoon with Hester going through the practical preparations. The cradle that needed to come down from the Winslow attic and be cleaned and repaired. The linens that needed washing. The things that needed to be arranged and confirmed with the midwife in Millhaven. A woman named Gertrude Foss, who had delivered half the babies in the valley and who had the calm authority of someone who has presided over enough of the frontier's most dramatic moments to find very little surprising. "You are healthy," Delphine said, watching Hester move around the kitchen with her usual efficient energy. "That is the main thing." "I am very healthy," Hester agreed. "Rather annoyingly so, given that everyone seems to expect me to be delicate," Delphine laughed. "You have never been delicate a day in your life." "I was delicate last February," Hester said, "in the barn." Delphine looked at her with a knowing expression. "That is different. That is not delicate. That is human. There is a distinction." Hester thought about the distinction. "Yes," she said, "there is." Cyrus, for his part, proved to be the kind of expectant father who did not hover or fuss, but who paid very close attention, the kind that notices things. He noticed when she was tired before she said so. He adjusted the morning work schedule so she was not hauling water in her 7th month. He read the medical almanac she had ordered from Denver so thoroughly that she suspected he had memorized significant portions of it, though he deployed this knowledge with restraint and did not lecture her on her own condition. One evening in October, almost exactly a year after Thomas's death, he came and found her at the grave. She had walked out there alone in the late afternoon, something she did periodically, a habit of remembrance. The grave was on the east boundary of what had been her homestead property, on a small rise above the creek, under a cottonwood that had gone gold in the autumn. She had replaced the wooden cross with a proper stone marker in the spring, carved by a man in Millhaven, and she kept the area tended. Cyrus had not come to watch her or to intervene. He had simply come because he knew where she would be and because he thought she might want company, and he was willing to be wrong about that. She heard him come through the grass and did not turn around, and he came and stood beside her exactly as he had a year ago. Beside her, not behind. "It has been a year," she said. "Yes, he would have been 5 years old," she said. "He would have been running all over this ranch and getting into everything." "Yes," Cyrus said, "he would have been terrifying." She smiled because it was true. Thomas at 4 had been a force of nature. At 5 he would have been genuinely dangerous to the orderly operation of any livestock enterprise. "He never got to meet you," she said. "That is the part that stays with me. He would have loved you." Cyrus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me about him." So she did. Standing at the grave in the October afternoon, her hand in Cyrus's hand and the mountains going pink in the light, she told him about Thomas. About the specific way he laughed, which involved his whole face, and usually some kind of accompanying physical action, falling over or throwing himself against the nearest surface. About his obsession with horses and the tin horse he had carried everywhere. About the way he had said her name, which he had for some time pronounced as something between Hester and Hesper, and which she had secretly loved. About the morning she had found him arranging a row of pebbles along the front porch railing with complete seriousness, and when she asked what he was doing he said he was putting them in order, though what order he could not specify. Cyrus listened to all of it. He asked questions. Real questions, the kind that drew out more, that said he wanted to know and not just to be seen wanting to know. When she finished they stood quietly for a while. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For asking, for wanting to know him even this way." "He was part of you before I knew you," Cyrus said. "Of course I want to know him." She leaned her head against his shoulder. The baby moved inside her, the particular rolling, insistent movement of the last weeks of pregnancy, and she put her free hand on her side and felt it, and Cyrus put his hand over hers. The child was born on November the 14th, 1879. Gertrude Foss arrived in the early hours of the morning and took charge of the situation with the calm authority Hester had been counting on, and Mrs. Alderson came and helped, and Cyrus paced the main room downstairs with Walt and George and Rolf Hosser, who had come with Delphine. 4 grown men trying to be useful by existing, which was all they could do. The baby came at sunrise. It was a boy. Gertrude put him in Hester's arms, and Hester looked at his astonishing, impossible face, red and furious and squinting against the morning light, and felt something so large and complete move through her that she could not have named it with any single word. It was love and grief and gratitude and terror, and an overwhelming sense of the continuity of things, life insisting on itself even in the places where it had been broken. Cyrus came up when Gertrude called him, and Hester put the baby in his arms and watched Cyrus Winslow hold his son for the first time, watched the careful way he supported the small weight, watched his face go through a series of expressions too complex and too genuine to fully read. "He is extraordinary," Cyrus said. His voice was rough. "He is," Hester agreed. "What shall we name him?" They had discussed names. They had a list. Hester looked at the baby in Cyrus's arms, at the specific, indignant, determined quality of his small face, and said, "James, for the middle name Thomas." Cyrus looked at her. "James Thomas Winslow, if you agree." "I agree completely," he said. They brought James Thomas Winslow home through a day that had turned bright and cold, the mountains crystalline and enormous against the blue sky, and Mrs. Alderson had the kitchen warm and the house smelling of fresh bread and soup, and Delphine had decorated the front room with autumn branches from the cottonwood, and everyone who had come to help over the past hours was still there, sitting in the warm kitchen with coffee. Because that is what people do when something important has happened, and they are not ready for the ordinary world yet. Walt, who was 62 and gruff, and had seemed entirely unmoved by the dramatic events of the morning, looked at baby James for approximately 4 seconds and then looked firmly away, and cleared his throat and asked George in a loud voice whether he'd got the east pasture gate repaired yet, which was a transparent attempt to appear unaffected by the infant that convinced absolutely no one. Hester sat in the rocking chair by the stove with James in her arms and accepted Mrs. Alderson's soup, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was uncomplicated. The grief was still there. It would always be there, but it was not the first thing anymore. The first thing was this room full of people who had shown up. The man beside her who had come 15 miles in the snow to tell her she did not have to carry everything alone, and the small new weight in her arms who was already twisting his face toward the sound of her voice. Cyrus sat on the arm of the chair and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and baby James made a sound that was either contentment or preliminary complaint, and the mountain light came through the south windows and fell across the 3 of them. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the winter Hester would remember afterward as the one when she learned what home actually meant, not a place of origin or a place of shelter, but a specific accumulation of people and habits and daily acts of choosing each other. Home was James in the cradle that Cyrus rocked at 3 in the morning when Hester had reached her limit. Home was breakfast together when the windows were white with frost and the stove was the warmest thing in the world. Home was Walt and George and Mrs. Alderson, who came 3 days a week and taught Hester 3 new recipes for dried apple cake that were each demonstrably superior to her previous version. Home was Delphine riding over in February and sitting in the kitchen for 3 hours talking about everything and nothing. Home was Cyrus at the end of the day, coming in from the cold with mud on his boots and a detailed report on the state of the south fence line, and the particular quality of his attention, the way he turned it fully on her when they talked, like the sun coming from behind a cloud. She went back to full working capacity in March when James was 4 months old and had achieved a sleeping schedule that, while not exactly reliable, was reliable enough. She worked the cattle with Cyrus and George on the morning rounds, wearing James in a sling she had made from a wool blanket that Mrs. Alderson had initially regarded with deep skepticism, and then quietly conceded was effective. And she had the satisfaction of watching her son grow up in the open air of the ranch she and Cyrus had built together, which she suspected would make him an entirely different kind of person than he would have been in an Ohio farmhouse. She rode out to the grave on Thomas's birthday in February, as she always did. Cyrus came with her this time, and she held James on the saddle in front of her, and she stood at the marker and talked to Thomas in a quiet voice, telling him about his brother, because that was what felt true to do. "He looks like you did," she told the grave. "That same quality of being extremely convinced of the importance of his own opinions." Cyrus made a sound behind her that might have been agreement or might have been laughter carefully suppressed. She turned and looked at him with the particular expression she had developed for moments when he was being quietly amused at her expense, and he met her eyes with complete innocence, and she felt the love she had for this man as a specific and locatable thing, present in her chest like a permanent warmth, like a coal that had caught properly and would not go out. They rode home through the February cold with James asleep against her chest, and the mountains were the hard blue-white of deep winter, and the creek ran dark between its ice banks, and the ranch house came into view with smoke rising from both chimneys because Mrs. Alderson had come early and started the stove in the room they used as an office, and Hester felt the full weight of the word home press into her chest like something precious. The following years built themselves one atop the other with the patient accumulation of real living. The ranch grew. By 1882, they had 80 head of cattle and had hired a third permanent hand, a young man named Daniel Reyes, who had grown up on the Rio Grande and who had a gift for working with horses that quickly made him indispensable. The Dawson property, which had been folded into the Winslow operation, was now producing reliably as a summer grazing section, and Cyrus had a plan, which he and Hester had developed together over several months of kitchen-table evenings, for a modest expansion into horse breeding that the regional demand would support. James grew into a toddler who had indeed inherited Thomas's philosophical approach to the arrangement of small objects and Malcolm's square-jawed stubbornness, and Hester's capacity for loud opinion, combined with Cyrus's strange patience, which appeared in the boy as long intervals of total stillness followed by sudden decisive action that surprised everyone including himself. He was, by his second birthday, clearly going to be an interesting person. Hester had a second child in 1882, a girl they named Clara Ruth, who arrived in August with considerably less drama than her brother, and who, within 6 weeks, had organized everyone in the household around her preferences with an efficiency that suggested she had thought carefully about her strategy in advance. Walt, who had shown limited emotional response to James's birth, took one look at Clara Ruth and immediately became the kind of person who modified his daily schedule to include the maximum possible time in her vicinity, which he explained to anyone who asked by citing concerns about the structural integrity of the cradle that he had himself repaired, and which was therefore demonstrably sound. Hester watched this development with the private delight she reserved for moments when the world arranged itself into something better than she had expected, which happened more often than she had once thought possible. Cyrus with the children was one of the ongoing revelations of their life together. She had wondered, back at the beginning, how a man who had spent 12 years ranching alone would adapt to the particular chaos of an occupied household, and the answer was that he adapted with the same constitutional patience he brought to everything, combined with a specific gift for being taken entirely seriously by very small people. James at 2 had conversations with his father that lasted long enough to concern his mother, not because they were inappropriate, but because the level of gravity Cyrus brought to the discussion of whether the spotted calf was larger than the brown calf was slightly alarming in an otherwise rational adult. Clara Ruth, when she reached the conversational stage, expanded this into a full enterprise, and by the time she was 3, the evening meal at the Winslow table was an event of such elaborate discussion that they regularly sat there long after the food was finished, and Mrs. Alderson, who stayed late on those evenings on no particular pretext, enjoyed them as thoroughly as anyone. In 1883, a man came to Millhaven who threatened, for 6 weeks, to unsettle everything. His name was Garrett Pike, and he was a land agent from Denver, sent by a syndicate that was acquiring ranch land throughout the Colorado Valley for a consolidated cattle operation that he described, to anyone who would listen, as the inevitable future of Western ranching. He had money to spend, and he was spending it, making offers to ranchers throughout the valley that were significantly above market value, which was either genuinely generous or, as Cyrus noted quietly to Hester after their first meeting with Pike in the Millhaven Hotel, a sign that the syndicate needed the land badly enough to pay a premium, which meant there was something about the land they were not disclosing. Pike offered them $4,000 for the Winslow Dawson operation. It was a significant sum, more money than Hester had ever held a clear concept of, and more than the land was worth by conventional measure. She sat across from Cyrus at the kitchen table that evening after the children were in bed, and they looked at each other in the lamplight. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think the offer is suspicious," he said. "It is very high. It is very high because he wants it very badly. The question is why." They spent the next 2 weeks finding out. Cyrus rode to Denver and met with a lawyer named Hargrove who had dealt with the syndicate on another land acquisition, and who told Cyrus, with the careful precision of a man who understood what he was imparting, that the syndicate had information from the Territorial Survey Office suggesting that the water rights in the Millhaven Valley were about to become dramatically more valuable as the railroad expansion came north, and that whoever held the land with the creek access would hold a position of considerable leverage in the coming decade. Their land had the best creek access in the valley. Cyrus came home and told Hester what he had learned, and she sat with it for a full evening thinking through the implications. "If we sell," she said, "we get the $4,000 and lose the leverage. Yes. If we stay, we hold the leverage, but we are dealing with a syndicate that will likely continue to apply pressure." "Yes." She looked at the table. "What kind of pressure?" "I do not know exactly," he said. "I think it could become difficult." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This is our land, Cyrus. This is the Dawson land and the Winslow land, and it is what our children will inherit, and it is where Thomas is buried. I am not interested in selling it to a Denver syndicate because they want the water rights." He looked at her steadily. "That is what I think as well. I wanted to hear you say it." "You already knew." "I had a very strong suspicion," he agreed. "They told Pike no." Pike raised his offer. They told him no again. Pike indicated that the syndicate had other means of pursuing their interests and that the Winslows should carefully consider their position. Cyrus met this statement with the particular quality of stillness that Hester had come to recognize as his response to genuine threat. Not alarm, not aggression, just a very careful attention that took in everything and gave back nothing until it was ready. "Mr. Pike," he said, "I have ranched in this valley for 17 years. I know every family on this land, and every family knows me. If your syndicate attempts to apply inappropriate pressure in this area, you will find that the community response is not what you have modeled for." He paused. "I suggest you take your money to a less established range." Pike left Millhaven 2 weeks later. The syndicate made no further approaches. Hester heard about the meeting afterward from the Millhaven Hotel owner, who had been present, and who told her with undisguised admiration that Cyrus Winslow had sat across from the land agent with the complete confidence of a man who knew exactly where his ground was and was standing on it. She told Cyrus this at supper, and he shrugged in a way that was meant to be dismissive, but which she had learned well enough to read as slightly pleased. "You were not worried?" she asked. "Of course I was worried," he said. "But being worried and being uncertain are different things. I was not uncertain." She looked at him across the table, with James eating enthusiastically on one side and Clara Ruth explaining something at length on the other, and felt the specific love she had for this man, the love that had started at a grave in October and had been building every day since, rise in her chest like the tide. "Neither was I," she said. He met her eyes and the corner of his mouth lifted. "Neither were you," he agreed. The railroad came to the edge of the valley in 1885, as the survey information had suggested it would, and the water rights from their creek became as valuable as the Denver syndicate had anticipated, and the Winslows were in a position to negotiate from the strength of established ownership. The deal they made with the railroad company for access and water use was conducted through the Denver lawyer Hargrove, and was, by Hargrove's assessment, one of the more favorable he had seen negotiated by a private ranching family. They used part of the resulting income to properly stone-line the creek banks on their property, preserving the water access against drought years. They used another part to expand the horse breeding operation that had been producing steadily since 1882 under Daniel Ray's careful management. And they used a portion to build, at Hester's suggestion and Cyrus's complete agreement, a one-room schoolhouse on the Millhaven Road, which they donated to the community and which served the valley's children for the next 20 years. This last expenditure was the one Hester thought about most, because it was the one her mother would have understood immediately. A schoolteacher's daughter building a school on the frontier. There was a straight line there that she found deeply satisfying. James started at the school in 1886 at the age of 6, under the instruction of a young woman named Miss Adelaide Prout, who had come from Illinois, and who was, by any measure, the best thing that had happened to Millhaven's intellectual life in a decade. She was also clearly terrified by the scope of what she had taken on, which Hester recognized immediately from a position of personal experience. She went to Miss Prout after the first week of school and invited her to Sunday dinner, and Miss Prout came and sat at the Winslow kitchen table and talked for 3 hours and ate an enormous amount of food and laughed several times at Cyrus's dry observations about the educational philosophy of very young children, and went home visibly less terrified than she had arrived. She became a regular guest. She came to know the family the way people come to know one another over tables and seasons, genuinely and irreversibly, and she was there at Clara's 6th birthday, and at James's first real ride on a full-grown horse, and at the November evening in 1887, when Hester and Cyrus told the children they were expecting another baby. James received this information with the solemn deliberation he brought to all important matters. Clara Ruth received it with immediate and detailed planning about sleeping arrangements and naming conventions. Cyrus and Hester exchanged a glance over their children's heads that contained multitudes. The third child was another boy, born in May of 1888, who they named Samuel after Cyrus's father, and who from the first weeks of his life had a quality of absolute serenity that stood in such marked contrast to the household's general operational tempo that he seemed occasionally to have arrived from a different and calmer world. "He gets it from you," Hester told Cyrus when Samuel was 3 weeks old and sleeping with the beatific stillness of someone who had decided that the world would present itself to him in due course, and there was no need to rush. "That is the most flattering thing you have ever said to me," Cyrus said. "It was meant as an observation, not a compliment." "I am choosing to receive it as a compliment," he said. She looked at him over Samuel's sleeping head. 10 years of mornings and evenings and difficult seasons and good ones, 10 years of Sundays and kitchen table conversations, and the daily choice of turning toward each other rather than away. His hair was more silver now than dark, and there were lines around his eyes that had not been there in 1878, and she was not the same woman she had been then either, harder in some ways and softer in others, more certain of herself in all the ways that mattered. She was 38 years old, and she was the most fortunate person she knew, which was a thing she would not have believed possible on the morning she found Thomas still in his small bed, but which was nevertheless true. "I love you," she said, not as a thing that needed saying in that moment, but as the kind of thing that should be said while the thought is present and clear. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes. "I love you," he said, Every part of you, including the parts you thought were a burden when I first met you. She thought about the woman who had stood at her son's grave and said she did not know how to let anyone help. She thought about how certain she had been in those months that the carrying was hers alone and would always be hers alone, that the weight was non-transferable and the only honest response to it was to endure it in silence. She thought about what it had meant to have someone simply come and stand beside her. "You were very patient," she said. "You were worth the patience." "You always say the right thing," she said. "Not always," he said. "But I try to say the true thing, and occasionally those overlap." She laughed, and Samuel stirred in her arms at the sound, and she settled him carefully. And outside the May evening was warm and golden, and the mountains were going through their elaborate sunset colors. And somewhere in the house James and Clara Ruth were engaged in an argument that had been going on for 20 minutes and showed no signs of resolution. It was loud, and it was full, and it was home. The years that followed were the years Hester would think of afterward as the deep years. Not because they lacked difficulty. There was always difficulty, a hard winter or a cattle illness or a difficult negotiation, but because they had a quality of rootedness that made even the difficult things feel manageable. You can weather a great deal when you know precisely where you stand. James grew into a serious young man of 20 who had inherited his father's patience and his mother's directness, and who showed an aptitude for the business side of ranching that led Cyrus, with considerable pride and excellent strategic sense, to begin involving him formally in the operations management decisions. Clara Ruth, who had been planning since the age of 6, went to a teaching college in Denver in 1893 and came back with a degree and strong opinions about educational reform and an eye on Adelaide Pruitt's eventual retirement from the Millhaven School. Samuel grew up quiet and observant and turned out, somewhat to everyone's surprise, to have a profound interest in horses rather than cattle, and became by the age of 14 Daniel Ray's most capable assistant in the breeding program. Hester and Cyrus grew older together in the specific way of people who have built something real and know it, with the daily satisfaction of a thing seen through and the quiet understanding that comes from years of choosing each other. She went to the grave every year on both days, Thomas's birthday and the day of his death, and Cyrus came with her always, and they stood together, and she talked to Thomas and Cyrus listened. And sometimes Cyrus told Thomas about the year that had passed, about James's latest thinking on the cattle markets, or Clara's latest campaign for better school books, or Samuel's latest success with the horses. And Hester listened to her husband talk to her son who had died before they met, and felt the particular love that comes from someone taking seriously the things that matter most to you. She had told Cyrus, in 1879, that Thomas would never know him, and that was the part she carried. She had come to believe over the years something slightly different, that Thomas was known in all the ways that had mattered in the care with which his name was spoken, and the tin horse on the windowsill that caught the morning light, and the son named for him who slept in the room that had once been his, and the grave that was tended and visited and never allowed to be simply a fact of the past. She carried him, but she carried him in community now, with someone beside her. That was what it meant to not carry it alone. Not that the weight was removed, not that the grief went away or that the losses were undone, but that someone stood beside you and carried their share of the weight willingly and without complaint, and in doing so made the whole thing possible. On a Sunday in October of 1898, 20 years after the grave that had started everything, Hester and Cyrus rode out together on the horses they had both ridden for the past decade, reliable and well-known companions, and stopped at the rise above the creek where the cottonwood had grown considerably and dropped its gold leaves over the stone marker in the October light. Hester was 48 years old. Cyrus was 54. James was home from a buying trip in Kansas and had brought a young woman he had met there, a rancher's daughter named Willa Marsh, who had been at the Winslow table the past 2 evenings and who Hester had watched with the careful affection she brought to everything that mattered to her children. Clara Ruth was teaching in Millhaven, and had announced that spring that she was marrying Thomas Hawser, Delphine's youngest son, which Hester had received with pure and uncomplicated delight, because it closed a particular circle in a way that felt right. Samuel at 19 was in the barn more often than the house, and was the person Daniel Ray's talked to first about anything involving the horses, which said everything necessary. Hester stood at the grave and felt all of it, the 20 years of weight and grace and daily, ordinary, extraordinary life, pressed into a single October afternoon. "It has been a long time," she said to the stone. She felt Cyrus's hand find hers. She thought about the woman she had been, standing at this same grave with her fists white-knuckled and her grief sealed tight, and her terror of being insufficient to the task of her own life. She thought about the 6 words that had broken that open. "You were right," she said to Cyrus. "About which part?" he asked. "I did not have to carry all of this by myself." He was quiet for a moment. The cottonwood dropped another handful of gold leaves. "Neither did I," he said. "I have said it to you before, but I want you to know I mean it both ways. You showed up for my life too, Hester. Everything I have, the ranch and the children and the years worth having, I did not build that alone." She turned and looked at him, this man with his silver-streaked hair and the lines of decades in his face and his gray-green eyes that had been steady and direct from the first moment she had truly seen them. "We built it together," she said. "We did," he said. "And we will go on building it." She put her free hand against his chest, and he covered it with his, and they stood together at the grave of her son in the October light, with the mountains behind them and the ranch ahead and the family waiting at the house, and the world was full and real and completely theirs. She had come to this grave in the worst moment of her life, and she had not known how to receive help. She had learned. It had taken time and grief, and the particular courage of opening her hands, and letting something in rather than holding on to control so tightly it cost her everything. She had learned that love is not a replacement for what is lost. It does not fill the shapes left by the dead. It grows in its own shape alongside the grief, rooted in the same soil, reaching toward the same light, and in time the two things become so intertwined that you cannot imagine one without the other. She had learned that the strongest thing a person can do is to say yes when someone offers to stand beside them. She had learned that home is not where you come from. It is where you choose, every day, to return. The October wind moved through the cottonwood and the gold leaves fell and the mountains stood enormous and indifferent and magnificent in the blue afternoon, and Hester Dawson Winslow and Cyrus Winslow stood together at a grave that had once been the loneliest place she knew, and it was lonely no longer. There were voices from the ranch house, faint but audible on the wind, James calling something, Clara's laugh, the distant whinny of Samuel's horses from the paddock. Mrs. Alderson was long retired now, but Hester could still hear her voice sometimes in the way the kitchen smelled in the mornings, and she thought of Delphine, who came to dinner on Thursdays, and of Walt, who had finally retired the previous year and lived in Millhaven and came out on Sundays still, because Sunday was what it was. "We should go back," Hester said. "We should," Cyrus agreed. But neither of them moved for another moment, standing in the October light, holding on to the quiet. Then Hester squeezed her husband's hand and turned toward home, and he turned with her, and they walked together through the gold-scattered grass toward everything they had made, and behind them the grave stood peaceful in the afternoon, and the mountains kept their ancient patient watch, and the sky was clear from one edge of the world to the other. The story was not finished. It never would be, because life does not close on a page but continues into the ordinary, extraordinary days that are the actual substance of being alive. James would marry Willa Marsh in the spring and bring her home to the ranch. Clara Ruth would teach in Millhaven for another 30 years, and would see 3 generations of valley children learn to read under the schoolhouse roof that Hester had built. Samuel would develop the horse breeding program into something of real regional significance, and would mentor young Daniel Ray's sons when their time came. There would be grandchildren eventually, tumbling and loud and utterly themselves. And there would be Sundays at the table that went on long past the food. And there would be difficulty because there always is. And there would be the daily practice of choosing each other and the daily reward of that choosing. And every October, Hester and Cyrus would ride out to the grave above the creek and stand together in the falling light, and she would carry what she carried, and he would stand beside her, and it would be enough. It would be more than enough. It would be everything.